I'm Rufus Griscom, and this is The Next Big Idea. Today, the playbook for living a long and healthy life. For decades, Eric Topol has been fascinated by people who reach old age, we're talking about 80, 90 years old, with a clean bill of health. People who are frisky, socially engaged, and unburdened by age-related disease. In 2008, he decided to do something about that fascination. Eric's a cardiologist and research scientist, so he did what he's trained to do. He set up a study. He and his team at Scripps Research, the largest nonprofit biomedical institute in the United States, crisscrossed the country, eventually signing up 1,400 participants.
It took 7 years to find these people on a national hunt. They're just rarefied. Essentially, the best part was to get their medical records because there was nothing in the medical records.
It's hard to overstate how unusual that is. 80% of Americans over the age of 65 have 2 or more chronic diseases. Most of the time, that means they're dealing with one of the big 4, diabetes, heart disease, cancer, or some kind of neurodegeneration. But the super-agers Eric and his team tracked down, they've never been sick. They weren't even taking medication. Eric and his team figured, okay, it must be something in their genes. That must be why these folks have such exceptional health spans. So they did whole genome sequencing.
And found basically that the genes were not the story, except in, rare situations out of that group.
Instead, the folks Eric studied, he calls them the welderly, were often the last ones standing in their families.
And you say, well, hey, you don't need a whole genome sequence to know that that's not genetics, because if it was, you wouldn't have only one person living 20, 30, 40 years beyond their closest relatives.
Longevity, Eric says, is maybe 10% genetics. So what's the other 90%? That's the subject of his new book, Super-Agers, an evidence-based approach to longevity, which was chosen by our curators, Adam Grant, Malcolm Gladwell, Susan Cain, and Daniel Pink, as one of the 8 best books of the year. Super-Agers is about the new drugs, scientific breakthroughs, and tech innovations that are poised to help more people live long, healthy lives. But it's also about what we can do, what you and I can do in our day-to-day lives with our diets, exercise regime, and sleep habits to extend our health spans so we have more years to spend doing the things that make life worth living. Playing with our kids and grandkids, dogs, traveling, creating, being fully ourselves, instead of just managing our decline. And here's the good news. The big 4 diseases of aging I mentioned a moment ago,
they take 20 years in our body to incubate, and it goes into an accelerated phase, 60 years plus, when our inflammation just starts to really rise and our immune system is dysregulated.
Stave off that inflammation, keep your immune system healthy, and you might just join the ranks of the welderly.
In my view, we're not going to stop aging. There's a lot of efforts, as you know, to reverse aging. But what we can do is make the aging a much more resilient, make our immune system healthy and intact as long as possible.
Eric, as I mentioned, is a cardiologist and research scientist. But that doesn't really do him justice. He's one of the world's 10 most cited researchers in medicine. And given his eminence in the field, he's not afraid to call BS on other physicians, some of whom we've had on this show, whose claims he feels do not pass muster.
This whole thing has gotten a little cuckoo. Where are the data? Where is the evidence in well-regarded, peer-reviewed studies from highly respected investigators? They fit into this basic category of bro science. They don't necessarily have the data to back things up. What are the downsides? What about the potential conflicts? All these things have to be totally transparent. And so, no, I'm not into experimenting when it can be dangerous.
Eric and I spoke for more than 2 hours. We covered everything from why your grip strength might be more important than your blood pressure, to why most supplements are basically an expensive waste of time, to the revolutionary drugs that are changing how we think about weight loss, addiction, and maybe even Alzheimer's. We covered so much ground that we decided to split it into 2 episodes. Today, we dive into exercise and diet, including how much protein you really need and why your morning coffee might be the best drug that you're taking. Next week, we'll tackle sleep, breakthrough drugs like GLP-1s, and how AI is about to completely reshape medicine. If you can't wait to hear that episode, it's available right now in the Next Big Idea app. Just go to your app store and search for Next Big Idea. Welcome, Dr. Eric Topol, to the Next Big Idea.
Rufus, it's great to be with you. Thanks.
Eric, you've been practicing medicine for more than 45 years, I think.
No, not quite that long, but pushing 40, yeah.
Okay, pushing 40. You published, I think, 1,300 research articles, and you've witnessed extraordinary change in the field. Would you describe this as a revolutionary time for modern medicine?
Absolutely. The thesis or the premise, super-agers, is that we are at a unique, propitious moment in medicine. We've never been here before.
And I think we all aspire to become not just elderly, but welderly, as you say. What does it mean to be welderly?
Yeah, I mean, the term I prefer even better than super-agers, because I think that's what we should aspire to be, which is roughly defined as, 85 years plus and no major age-related diseases of cancer, cardiovascular, or neurodegenerative. Right now, we have the elderly.
Yes.
As you know, Rufus, where we have most people are 65 plus, have at least one of those diseases, if not 2 or 3. So we have to make a flip here. And we haven't really been able to do that before. So that's what's so exciting right now.
Part of what I do is just cheerlead all the extraordinary scientists like yourself who are out there improving people's health. And there's extraordinary research being done right now that we'll get into in this conversation. But the other half of it is what I can do, what we all can do, everybody listening with our lifestyles. You call it lifestyle plus. What's the plus?
Yeah, I couldn't come up with a better name, Rufus. I struggle with that because people know lifestyle, diet, and exercise. And in more recent years, the sleep has gotten to a kind of tantamount level of importance. But what they don't realize is a lot of new data that's come in on social engagement, on nature, being out in nature, on things like the detrimental effects of these environmental burdens that we're not doing anything about. So there's a bunch of layers of lifestyle that expand this story now. I wish I had come up with a better name, but plus was the only thing I could think of, because basically we're talking about the environment as well as the things that are under our control. If we're going to be isolated and stay lonely, or are we going to go out and be with other people? Are we going to, do our best to get outdoors, which is, important for both physical and mental health? These things, many had regarded as social science. Maybe it's kind of soft, but when you look at the data, it gets pretty impressive.
So getting into some of the details of how we can all get better at our lifestyles and controlling also these plus variables, I think exercise, you say, might be the single most powerful intervention that we can make to slow the body-wide aging clock. Would you say that? And what's your advice to people when it comes to moving our bodies?
Yeah, so you touched on something very important there, which is now we have these aging clocks. We didn't have that some years ago. And not only are we starting to see body-wide aging, but now we got organ aging. We got everything aging. We can measure it and say, okay, Rufus, you're whatever age and your body-wide aging is 7 years more. Something's off track here. Or on the other hand, your biological age through methylation is younger than you, which is great. Now, it turns out the only thing that's been shown to change methylation or so-called epigenetic age, the Horvath clock, is exercise. Now, there may be other things someday, but nothing else has been so well demonstrated. And that goes along with the fact that all the other data is emphasizing the vital importance of physical activity. Ideally moderate to vigorous, but even any activity helps. And this is something that I think has been refined over recent years, that as a cardiologist, I would always say, aerobic and, bicycle, walking, treadmill, swimming, something like that. But of course, that's not enough. We need resistance training, balance training. These things are free, push-ups and
Yeah,
sit-ups,
sure.
and lunges and planks. I mean, you can do this stuff. It doesn't cost a dime. But exercise is, if you had to pick one that has such a dominant impact. And my friend and colleague, Ewan Ashley, I quoted him in the book because when we spoke about this, he says to all his patients, 1 minute of exercise is equal to 5 minutes of more healthy aging.
I
So
love
it's a
that.
really good investment, and the data are pretty close to supporting that, actually.
I think he also says 1 minute of intense exercise is equal to something like 8 minutes of life,
exactly.
right? So every minute you're out there, you get another 5 to 8 minutes back. And as you say, exercise is free, although there are a lot of people who'd like to take your money to do so.
Yeah. No, you don't have to join the gym.
Some of it.
Yeah, you could just go do this without a gym and without fancy equipment, actually. But also, going back to that point, is another interesting thing we don't know. There's always lots of unknowns checkered through all this, is how extreme. Because some exercise nuts are going to say, I go to beyond the max. And we don't know if that's actually, it isn't proportional necessarily. There may be a plateau. And so that's one of the things that's still a little bit fuzzy right now, is how extreme does the benefit they correlate?
Yes. And actually, we had your friend Peter Attia on the show, and we talked about precisely this point. At what point are there diminishing returns at some point, or even negative impacts from too much exercise? Here's what Peter said.
There is no upper limit to the benefit that comes from increased fitness, increased muscle mass, increased strength, especially increased cardio fitness. We see no upper bound to that limit.
Well, yeah, Peter and I discussed that. I did a podcast with him after Outlive. And, in general, I thought there were many good things in the book, and I've known Peter over several years. But the data don't support what he said. In fact, as I reviewed in the book, in super-agers, is that there may actually be detrimental effects of extreme exercise. And we have seen that in high-tier elite athletes with more atrial fibrillation and athletes hard and various things. The other thing about Peter, when he wrote the book Outlive with his colleague, he mentioned basically he was exercising 4 hours a day. Now, I don't know anyone, Rufus, who exercises 4 hours a day. And I think it's something that people keep in mind. He's had a lot of people read his book and listen to his podcast and talk about extreme. Now, to be clear, I love that you had the audio clip there. It's good to hear Peter's voice. But let's just point out that when I talked to him and I challenged him about the 4 hours a day of exercise, he says, I brought it down to 2 now.
Yeah.
Well, you know what? 2 hours is still a lot of exercise. I wish I had time to spend for 2 hours a day. I think if you could do an hour, that's fantastic,
Yeah.
But some of his things are just not generalizable. And they fit into this basic category of bro science. This is the bros. They don't necessarily have the data to back things up. And that's where some of the things, some things that Peter wrote about, he did a really great job, like metabolic syndrome.
Yes.
And then some things he just went off the rails, like that one, like protein overdose.
Yeah.
The total body MRI, rapamycin. I could give you a long list of things that I found objectionable based on the totality of evidence.
What he said in our conversation was that, sure, ultramarathon runners, people who run 100-mile ultramarathons see, negative impacts over time, right? I mean, they tend not to live as long, I believe the data shows. But very, very few people actually suffer from too much exercise, right? There are very few of us who have that problem. I'm very interested to know how your own exercise regime has changed over time. I think that much like your advice to patients, you had embraced cardio, but not so much strength training, and you changed that.
Yes, I did. I like to respond to the data, and I think the revision that occurred in recent years about how critical strength training is, core body strength, changed me. Because I used to do, aerobic exercise at least 5 times a week, 30, 40 minutes, and that was it. But then now I very much incorporated strength training and balance training. Of course, I'm older now. It's even more important. I wish I'd started earlier.
Yes.
But I think it's critical, and I'm more fit than I've ever been in my life.
Amazing.
So it's really worth it. And I'm glad I've invested that extra time in that balanced activity, not just on balancing, but also on the strength training, because, I think this is going to help. I built up a lot more muscle mass than I had, and I enjoy it. I won't do it for too many hours, though.
Yeah.
But I think it's really important, but it's data-driven. It's whether it's the resistance training amount of time, 100 minutes a week, or whether it's hand grip strength, there's very good link between strength and healthy aging.
I have been optimizing for the least amount of time I can spend exercising while getting the greatest amount of benefit. And so my standard thing is I run a couple miles every day that I don't play racket sports, which I love to do. That's my preferred thing to do. And I'll do only a couple miles, but I'll do 5 all-out 45-second sprints and walk those off. And usually when I'm running, I'm listening to a book like yours. And then I give myself permission to stop running and write down notes as I respond to something, as I'm going. And so I enjoy it because I look forward to listening to podcasts and audiobooks. But I'm able to get it done in only 20, 25 minutes because it's just a couple miles. I don't know if that's enough.
No, I think it's great, really. And you're also doing some type of resistance training too?
I'm doing that now. That's been, like yourself, that has been a recent revelation and resolution. And so I'm now doing 2 to 3 days a week of resistance training. I'm applying what I've learned from James Clear about habits, which is if I just begin the habit and start to enjoy it, then I can ramp it up. I'm currently only doing maybe 15 minutes or something of weightlifting at a time, but I figure you start to enjoy the feeling of it. You start to enjoy the soreness and build on it, in my experience.
That's great. No, you're off to the races with that. That's perfect.
The other thing I find fascinating, though, is the opportunities to do contextual exercise, which actually I learned a new term from you, which is vigorous intermittent lifestyle physical activity, or VILPA. You had a social post about this. It turns out that 3 to 4 1-minute bursts of VILPA a day are linked to a 40% lower all-cause and cancer mortality. Just things I imagine, like carrying luggage or lifting something heavy, running up the stairs. I think so many of us compartmentalize our exercise. So we're like, I can only break a sweat if I'm in my spandex outfit, right? And then I'm going to pay people to carry my luggage, or I'm going to avoid any exertions, right? But it seems like there's a strong argument for just sort of living more vigorously and looking for opportunities to move our bodies.
It's really interesting you point that out, because for all the years, again, in my practice in cardiology, we were telling people, don't be weekend warriors. That's detrimental.
Right.
Don't do that. You got to get more than just the weekend days to do your exercise. And now all the studies recently that's come out, hey, you know what? If you can only work on the weekends and do some really good exercise, that's great. That is very beneficial in health outcomes and healthy aging. And whenever I talk to patients about this, I go through the details, just like you were saying about when can you exercise? What time of day do you have an opportunity? What days of the week? What is impairing or impeding your chance to do it? What can you do? What do you have stuff in your home? Do you have to go somewhere? Because those things, those little things of that conversation are so fundamental. to getting people to start.
How about walking?
Yeah.
How important is walking?
Well, walking is fundamental. Brisk walking, of course, is even better.
Right.
So, yeah, walking is, it's great. And I think a lot of people don't realize it, especially in people of more advanced age. That's the one thing that they can do easily. And, it's a very perfectly fine form of aerobic exercise.
A lot of people talk about 10,000 steps.
Yeah.
Do you have a view of what kind of goals we should have? Is it simply the more the better? How do you think about it?
Yeah, and the more the better. You see benefit even as low as 4,000 steps per day. The problem is that some people will take steps from their fitness band or smartwatch or ring or whatever, and they'll say, oh, I got 4,000 steps, but that wasn't sustained activity. It needs to be 4,000, minimum, where you're just, going for a walk, right? Getting real steps, not just throughout the day of walking around in the house or something. Now, it just keeps getting better, 10,000, 12,000. There's nothing magical about 10,000. So this is one I would actually be in alignment with Peter Attia, which is on the walking side, because you can never get too vigorous walking. You're never going to max out there for benefit.
It's extraordinary that I think you just celebrated a 71st birthday.
Yeah, unfortunately, yeah.
and you say that you've never been stronger. That's a great thing to be able to say. And are you doing the full range of exercises, all the major muscle groups, weights, bands, all of the above?
Yeah, it's really funny. I do all these things. I do what's called a cobra on the floor to get really good core strength and, planks and the works. But recently, I was doing a podcast with Dax Shepard.
Yes.
And it's the second time I'd done a podcast with him, previously 6 years ago when I wrote a book, Deep Medicine. And Dax is one of the most fit guys I've ever met. And the first time I did the podcast with him, he takes a picture together and like his muscles are like bulging out after, because he has like a sleeveless shirt on, right? And so this time, the picture taken, I already had something to show, not at the level of Dax, but, some pretty substantial muscular development that I didn't have. But he took me over to his gym on the site where they do the podcast at his house. And he said, Eric, you've got to get into deadlifting. That's the key. And so I have. He's taken me to the next level now. He brought me on the podcast to help, some of the things we're talking about. And the reciprocal thing actually happened where he said the best thing I ever done is get a hex bar and weights, and it's helped me in so many ways. So now I'm into that now. I'm enjoying that new kind of challenge.
Now, I've been fascinated by the data on grip strength because, right, it keeps coming up as being highly correlated with longevity. You write that a 5-kilo drop in hand grip predicts a 16% jump in all-cause deaths.
Yeah.
And I think you say that grip strength beats blood pressure as a predictor of heart disease and all-cause death. So that, to me, is extraordinary. Do you think it is just a signal for overall fitness? Is that what it is? Or is there something specific about the grip?
I kind of think of it as a surrogate for your upper body strength. But there again, it's a story about muscle mass as opposed to muscle wasting. And I think it's really tied into healthy aging by that mechanism. When you have really good muscle mass preservation as you get older, that's also a reflection that you've been challenging your immune system and you've been tweaking it, you've been tuning it. Because every time you exercise, you get a little inflammation, particularly, strength exercising and aerobic exercising, and your body is seeing that as another test to get you're cultivating a healthy immune system. And I think all these things together help explain that what we had missed for years is that a simple measure like hand grip strength, because it's harder to measure some of the other muscle groups, but that's a simple way to get at it, is a window to your upper body and total body strength.
Interesting, right. So we know correlation does not imply causation. If we sat and did nothing but work on our grip strength all day long, that would not necessarily dramatically increase our longevity, right? This is more that it's an indicator, and balance is another indicator. I know there's a test where you stand on one foot and see how long you can balance. I think you want to be able to balance for greater than 45 seconds or something.
A minute, really, on each one. And you also want to be able to do touchdowns, on each one with one foot on the ground, or it's even better if you do it on a foam pad. It makes it more challenging. But yeah, that's a real important goal because that's another reflection of your core body strength, but also, your propensity to fall. And if you want to have one quick way to interrupt healthy aging when you get older, falling is right up there.
Right. And balance, I also think, is probably a cognitive factor, right? I mean, your brain needs to be working well to balance well.
Proprioception, because when you're standing on one foot, you're activating parts of your brain about perception or proprioception. So you're absolutely right.
When I'm standing on one foot, am I allowed to hop around a little bit if necessary, or must I keep the foot at the same place? I tried this recently.
Well, I don't know about hopping around, but you're going to be weighing.
Yeah.
Because the challenge is you're going to be really testing, you can't possibly stand perfectly still. So being able to adapt to the sway is kind of part of the challenge. And, if you can do a minute, you're doing really well. You can even take it longer. But balance training, it's easy to do it and get better. You can start where 10 seconds, you're already falling off. And, you do that for a few weeks and the minute seems like, hey, this is nothing. I need a bigger challenge.
Yeah. And I was interested to see you list posture as something that is a goal. And this is one that I'm working on. I'm kind of ridiculously tall at 6'3". It often feels like I'm being rude to people when I'm talking with them and I'm standing up straight because I'm a foot taller than a lot of people. So I think for very tall people, posture is a problem. How have you approached posture, and why does it matter?
Well, this is one of my biggest weaknesses, actually, Rufus. I'm the same height as you, and I was always hunched like a turtle. I just bad walking posture, bad everything posture. And of course, it isn't helped by looking at phones and screens and whatnot.
Exactly.
So that's one of the benefits of doing a lot of the core and strength training. I can tell it's so much easier for me to maintain standing up straight, shoulders back. That's the Cobra exercise, where if you can do that for 3 minutes, where you're on the floor and you've got, both arms up and you're basically, that upper body is off the floor for 3 minutes. When I first started doing that, like 15 seconds, 30 seconds. Now I can do that, if I had to, I can do it for 5 minutes. But that was the one thing that changed my posture. There are other ways to do it. I mean, some people get it through Pilates. Deadlifting is supposed to be helpful for posture as well. Anything that does a big core muscle improvement is going to help. But for me, I mean, it's hard. I used to have people say to me, why can't you're giving this lecture and you're lurched. What's wrong with you? So I'd had the feedback, but I never had acted upon it. And now I have.
I'm going to try that exercise. My preferred form of exercise, as I mentioned, is chasing a ball, whether it's a tennis ball or a pickleball or a squash ball, because it distracts me from, and there's a lot of balance and core in that. What I'm trying to do as I get older is do more of the things that give me joy and that are also interpersonal, right? Like it strengthens friendships and, it's social.
Well, you're fortunate because you've got the partners you can play with and you enjoy it. And look, that's a lot more fun than to do stuff, solo. So that's great. I think that's the ideal world, but a lot of people just don't have that ability to liaise with other partners to play and that kind of stuff.
Let's turn to diet, which is maybe the next most important or a critical lever we have to improve our health. I love talking about food. I think most of us love food. Unfortunately, sometimes we love the wrong kinds of food.
Or too much of it or whatever. Yeah.
That's right. Do you think it's appropriate to talk about food as medicine?
Yes, definitely. it turns out it's so darn important. It's right up there with exercise, as we've been discussing. And the American diet, as you know, you talked to my friend Chris Van Teleken, who I love that guy.
Yes.
And I love his book, Ultra Processed People. It's a great book.
Fantastic.
And Chris was on it. And this is not his area. I mean, he's an infectious disease specialist in the UK, but he pulled it all together. And since that book was published, things have even gotten more compelling, that ultra-processed food, with Americans leading the world, 70% of our diet, and younger people even higher, kids, teens, 80% of their diet, with these pro-inflammatory foods. And, the alien products that you wouldn't even know what the hell they are. And so there's something should be done about this. Nothing has been done. There's lots of talk, but no walk. The right diet, which has been proven time and time again to randomized trials, most recently in a big study of 105,000 people followed 30 years, only 9% reached age 70 with healthy aging, without age-related diseases.
Wow.
9%. And what did they eat? A Mediterranean diet. Okay?
Yeah.
So we know from inflammatory markers in the blood and from all these studies that a mainly plant-based diet with things like, salmon and lean chicken breast stuff and lots of fruits and vegetables, that's the best diet. It's anti-inflammatory. When you go into the other side with red meat and, fried foods and ultra-processed especially, that's the absolute worst. Sugar-sweetened beverages, these are bad things. So
Yeah.
This is the problem, that most people are not adjusting their diet. And the food industry, big food, they have
Yes.
learned what people are addicted to. And they are addicted to bad foods, unfortunately, and we're basically the prey for big food.
It is astonishing. I mean, you can't read Ultra Processed People by Chris Van Teleken without changing the way that you eat. And he makes such a persuasive case that UPFs today are a lot like cigarette smoking in the 50s and 60s, right? And you watch an old movie where people are chain smoking, and you just think, those poor people, they didn't know.
Yeah.
Right? They didn't know what those cigarettes were doing to them. And once you understand, I think, what ultra-processed food is actually doing to your body, you walk around in this wonderful country of ours and you see people eating this food, and you can't help but have the same reaction, which is these poor people don't know. It's no one's fault. It's not really, I think, a terrible, well-thought-out conspiracy. It's just been a slow process of realizing this is what this food does to you. All these companies are chasing profit, and we just have not, our government organizations are not putting in the right constraints. I think the Europeans are ahead of us on this.
They are ahead of us. And I would challenge that I think it is a conspiracy.
Okay.
Because, what happened here is that by adding all these things, like, for example, give you a much quicker rush
Yes.
to your reward centers with fat and sugar and textures, all the different manipulations of the food, they test this stuff in people.
Yes.
To make sure that they can't get enough of it and they'll eat more. And as you know, the randomized trials by Kevin Hall and others, where if you just give them ultra-processed food, they're going to gain a lot of weight. And the best experiment, the N of one, if you will, was Chris Van Teleken.
Yes.
When he did the Super Size Me equivalent, 30 days of eating ultra-processed food, and he had a brain scan and blood markers. His brain scan in 30 days already showed all sorts of abnormalities that were not there at baseline. The pro-inflammatory nature of these toxic foods cannot be underestimated. Now, there are some ingredients in that Nova Class 4, as I reviewed in the book that you're familiar with, that are not injurious. So you can't just say all ultra-processed constituents. But basically, most of them are, I call them UFOs, unidentified food objects, and they're really not food, as Chris points out. So this is something that has to urgently be addressed. As you say, Europe is much more on it than us. And it means, like the big tobacco, it means challenging big food. And they have a grip on the Department of Agriculture, as I've learned, which is profound. And, we have to mount something to counter this.
Absolutely. Yeah. And I'm going to revise my statement. I think it is a conspiracy. I think the point that Chris made, which I liked, was that when you talk to the executives in these food companies, they're at the mercy. If they don't make more money next quarter, they're going to be fired by the board. And his point was we shouldn't necessarily expect these big food companies to change their ways. This is why we have government. This is why we have regulations. But I think the food companies can be doing more.
Well, you know what's really interesting, Rufus, is what's been shown recently is when people take the GLP-1 drugs,
Yes.
they have less interest in ultra-processed foods. They not only eat less, but they eat healthier. And this is fascinating because this is tied into those reward circuits and is basically bypassing the toxicity of ultra-processed foods. And, it's wild. It's just totally wild. So no one predicted it. But what's interesting is now we're seeing reports that big foods are going to try to do things to appeal to the GLP-1 consumers. Because they lost their addiction, their affinity, if you will, and now more than 10% of Americans are taking these drugs, and that's going to go way up higher as the pills come along and the expense goes down, and the GLP-1 class of drugs has probably done more in medical history than any other class. So I think this is a really interesting observation that big food is having to contend with. It's a medication that is basically challenging their dominance.
Let's talk more about the foods that we should be eating.
Yeah.
One piece of fantastic news for me is that coffee, just the news gets better and better, right? This fits right in what I call I have a file, the title of which is Scientific Studies That Support the Life I Want to Live Anyway. Nothing is better news for me than the idea that 4 cups of coffee a day is just the right amount. I love coffee, and it seems to be cardioprotective and associated with longevity.
It's amazing. I mean, the coffee story, no matter how you look at it, of course, you don't have randomized trials, but there's so many large observational studies that have cinched this, in my view, that if you go up to 4 cups, so it doesn't mean that if you're drinking 1, you should go to 4, but up to 4 cups, you see benefit across the board. I mean, you're talking about survival, prevention of type 2 diabetes, cardiovascular, neurodegenerative. It's the one exception about something that people really enjoy, which is associated, and of course, the actual explanation is somewhat wanting, but their data are clear-cut in my view, and as summarized in the book, that this is the one thing that is beneficial. So don't worry about drinking coffee. We don't know as much about tea.
Yeah.
And we don't know as much about decaffeinated coffee because the studies haven't been as big for that, but we just can't be as sure about that.
And do we think it's polyphenols, antioxidants in the beans is what's doing it most likely?
Yeah, I think it goes with that theme that was mentioned earlier. Anything that reduces inflammation is going to wind up, particularly if it's on a long-term basis, it's going to wind up being beneficial to some extent. Yeah.
And then how about a fistful of seeds and nuts every day? This is more good news for me because I like seeds and nuts.
I'm a nut fan. I love nuts.
Yeah.
So yeah, that's great for you, and it's great source of protein as well, and it's correlated very well with healthy aging. You're probably going to get into the protein story.
Yes, please.
This is again where Peter and I have marked disagreement because he advocates 1 gram per pound of body weight per day. So, for me, I'm 180 pounds. I can't possibly take in 180 grams of protein. But even if I could, I shouldn't. And the reason for that is that's bro science. There's no data to support such high protein of 1 gram per pound. As you know, 1 kilogram per pound, which is about half, is reasonable. The recommended daily allowance is 0.8, but 1 gram per kilogram is okay. In fact, there are studies that take up to 1.2, 1.4 per kilogram that don't show potentiation of inflammation. But in all the models and all the studies that have been done that I think are, rigorous, once you get too high, you're pro-inflammatory. You're
Yeah.
also in the animal models, you're revving up atherosclerosis, which goes again with more inflammation. And the worst thing, if we're getting in that high protein, which is usually the case, you're having more animal protein. That's the ticket to inflammation. So this is something that I think is misguided. And, I reviewed all the data in the book on that. There's just no reason that people should go to such high doses of protein. Now, it's good to get 1 gram per kilogram and maybe a little bit more as we age, but otherwise we don't have any supportive evidence.
Part of that argument has been that, as I understand it, as we get older, we're not as good at processing protein. So it may be true, would you say, that many older people don't consume enough protein in order to support their muscles and muscle growth to offset the muscle loss so many people are having. But what you would say is these guys have gone way too far with their recommendations. But do you think that an average listener might should take a close look and make sure they're getting enough protein to support because now after listening to this podcast, everybody's going to go out and engage in resistance training, we know, and there is a requirement for some degree of protein, would you say?
Yeah, I mean, I think as you get older, 60 plus, you may want to bring it up a notch. A lot of people don't even get the 1 gram per kilogram, right? So, that's something to keep in mind. But just like we were talking about with exercise, there may be a hazard of going too extreme. And here, there's certainly a lot of suggestions that going beyond a certain limit, you're going to introduce a pro-inflammatory, untoward response, which we don't want to do.
Some additional good news in your book for me was that you seem to endorse whole fat dairy cheeses, in general, whole fat dairy. And I think you say particularly the harder cheeses. Like I had a delicious Gouda over the weekend, and I love a Parmesan. And I think that would be part of a healthy, 2 servings of dairy every day. Is that right?
Yeah, I think there it's not as benefit. It's not like coffee where you're seeing real benefit. It's just that it isn't the harm that you'd see, with ultra-processed foods or even red meat. But, a certain amount of dairy product and, like you say, cheeses is perfectly fine. I reviewed the data in the book, and it certainly looks, pretty encouraging.
And how about grains? Grains are one of these topics that have become somewhat controversial, or I'm getting mixed messages about it. We had Casey Means on the show, who now is President Trump's nominee for Surgeon General. She has a negative view on grains. Here's what she said.
A lot of the rationale for why whole grains are healthful is because they contain some vitamins and they contain some minerals and they contain fiber, which is great. Fiber is super important. But there are other foods with much lower glucose and carbohydrate, and therefore turning into glucose in the bloodstream, which you could eat a very small amount and get vastly more of the things that make whole grains healthful than if you ate the whole grains, which comes along with 30, 40, 50 grams of carbohydrates that are going into an already carb-intolerant body.
How do you react to that?
Yeah, I haven't read her book, Good Energy. And I do think, based on what I've heard, is that she has a similar negative view about ultra-processed food. But I would tend to disagree here. The data that I had mentioned earlier from all the Mediterranean diets that emphasize whole grain ingestion shows remarkable benefit. I do agree fiber is the goal, but that's often a very good source of natural fiber. The average person doesn't get 30 grams of fiber a day. Right? I mean, that's what you want to get. And that's going to help your gut. It's going to help prevent inflammation. It helps with satiety. So however you can get 30 grams of fiber, great. But, this whole carbohydrate restriction thing has gone a little cuckoo as well. Because if you're trying to lose weight and you can go through a very low carb diet, that's one way to lose weight. There's lots of ways to lose weight. The key is keeping the weight off, which is not, that's the thing that's not so easy without drug help. So I think this thing about, she's the principal of a glucose monitoring.
Yes, levels. Yeah.
And that may have affected her thinking. And so basically, I was on the Dexcom board for many years. I'm no longer, but I know about CGMs, all right? I know about spikes. And a lot of people will have significant spikes after carbohydrate ingestion. But we don't know what those spikes mean. Okay. If they're spikes to 150 and they're short after you have some granola for breakfast or something, to basically make the conclusion that you should not eat these foods based upon CGM, it might serve levels as a company, but we just don't know. Basically what the tact I took, Rufus, was give me hard evidence. And I've worn glucose sensors. I've seen my spikes. They're concerning. Most people will have spikes to certain foods, and carbohydrates are the usual ones. Now, if I have a piece of pizza, I know I'm going to have a terrible spike. I don't even want to have a monitor on, but I usually avoid it because I've seen what it does. I learned,
Yeah.
But that isn't exactly that pizza would be regarded as a whole grain or high fiber food. I mean, it's an unhealthy food,
That's right?
Okay.
So I used the CGM as well in preparation for that conversation with Casey. It was very interesting to see what creates these spikes. But you just said that you would prefer not to see your glucose spike. But at the same time, you've also said that we don't know for certain that too many glucose spikes are negative. I mean, I think the suspicion, right, is that if you have too many glucose spikes, it has an inflammatory effect.
Yeah, we have a paper coming out in Nature Medicine later this month where we took hundreds of people with CGM and their genome sequence, their gut microbiome, and pictures of their food and the works, electronic health record. And yes, if you have prolonged spikes, big spikes, 200, that seems to be, if you're pre-diabetic, a risk factor for progression, okay? And maybe better than hemoglobin A1C. But not many people have such profound spikes. The little glip to 150, and they're short, we don't know what those mean, frankly. And most people will have those for certain things they eat. And also, as you know, Rufus, having worn them, they're interdependent on how much sleep did you have?
Yeah.
What exercise? Are you under stress? It isn't just so simple, right?
Yeah.
I mean, you might eat the same food the next day after you've had a wonderful night of sleep and you've exercised and not had the spike. So we're overreacting to spikes, but I have to say, when they're big and long, and you already have something untoward about your glucose regulation, that's when it might be meaningful. But we need a lot more data about glucose spikes before going, hog wild about these.
Yeah, but it is quite clear that too much sugar is bad.
Yeah.
Right. That most Americans are consuming far, far, far too much sugar.
Absolutely.
Right? And in fact, I think actually this is one line I like that Casey had, which is our body's requirement for sugar is effectively zero.
Yeah.
It was of added sugars, unnatural added sugars.
I'm with her on that. Sugar is not our friend. Absolutely.
One of the most fascinating areas of discovery in the last decade or so has been the beginning of our better understanding the microbiome, right? There's just a revolutionary science of the microbiome that we're just learning more and more about. And we had Tim Spector on the show, a leading UK scientist, author of the wonderful book Food for Life. He makes the case for eating a really wide variety of plants every week. He says 30 is the optimal number. Here's Tim.
We did a study between the British gut and the American gut about 7 years ago, and it came up with a magic number of 30 plants is the optimum, which sounds a lot, but you've got to remember that each nut and seed, each herb and spice is also a plant in itself.
His argument is that this nourishes the microbiome. What do you think about that?
Well, first, I know Tim well. I visited with him, at King's College in London, and I think, highly of his work. And he's done some seminal work on assessing the response to glucose sensors we were just talking about and assessing the gut microbiome in these people. Now, having said that, what he's pushing for, and I agree, is diversity of your gut microbiome species. So you don't want to have it where there's one type of species that's overgrown and dominant and promoting inflammation. Now, turns out that this gut thing is much bigger than just a microbiome per se. These bacteria, they're metabolites, what they're making. And it's also the fact that the gut talks to the brain. There's a gut-brain axis, whether it's through the microbiome, whether it's through the metabolites, whether it's just through the cells lining of the gut. And it also talks to the immune system. The two most important organ or systems in our body that command healthy aging. It's basically that's, if you want to program healthy aging, it's your brain and your immune system. And what is controlling that so much or modulating it so much is the gut.
Yeah.
So the gut microbiome is part of the story of a bigger story, which is the whole gut hormone revolution. The GLP-1 and 15 other hormones that are part of this hormone story from either the gut itself or the pancreas or other parts of the digestive tract. These hormones talk to the brain and the immune system and the vagus nerve that connects the gut to the brain. So this interplay between the gut microbiome, its diversity, the actual constituents, its metabolites, and all these interactions between the gut and the rest of the body are critical. Now, there's all this work going on right now to manipulate the microbiome through prebiotics and probiotic and engineering. Jennifer Doudna wants to do genome editing of the microbiome to try to get rid of asthma in children. I mean, wild stuff, right? But I have to say, there's been a long warm-up, 20, 30 years of this gut microbiome story. And it isn't just the microbiome, it's these other parts of it. What's really taken the gut into another level is the hormone aspect. So I agree with Tim. I don't know about the 30, different plant sources, but we want to have a healthy, diverse microbiome constituents. And as you know, some of these are, when you have a dominant microbe, it could be correlated with a higher risk of colon cancer or other things. So we're learning a lot about these correlations as well.
Yeah. Well, and of course, we know, too, that the gut microbiome has a powerful impact on, or is absolutely critical to our immune system.
Yeah.
It affects our mood. It affects, all these other things. And I have, since talking with Tim, his book, Food for Life, really impacted my diet. And I've eaten a lot more vegetables, a lot more seeds and nuts, a lot more of, the fish and other things. And of course, I continue to indulge in coffee with great delight. Another variable that I think you and Tim agree on is the potential for personalized nutrition.
Yeah.
You say a one-size-fits-all diet is naive. How so?
Yeah, so each of us are unique, not just by our DNA, but in every respect. And that's the metabolite, how we metabolize foods, for example. So as Tim and previously Aaron Deagle, the group in Israel have shown, that if you give the exact same amount of food serving to the same people, a group of people, and you measure not just glucose, but also lipids like triglycerides, what you find is it's all over the map. Everybody has a different response to the exact amount of same food, the same time of the day, the same everything.
Yeah.
So we are unique, and this is just one reflection of that uniqueness. And so for example, some people, if they had a high carnivore red meat diet, they may not have pro-inflammation, whereas others, they may be very highly susceptible to that. We need to find out about that. There hasn't been the right study yet. Tim has a company, which is
the Zoe Project.
No, yeah. And of course, it's just in the early stages, but the NIH has a big project that going after this with, hopefully the funds won't get cut, but we do need to learn more about personalized nutrition. And so it isn't just the same diet for all people. We should be able to come up with, in you, Rufus, this is going to help the most. Whereas, these things probably best to be avoiding. And I learned a lot about this working with Aaron Siegel's data and trying it on myself. I wrote about it in Deep Medicine, which is all the things they told me to do was bad because, from the gut microbiome standpoint, we have a lot to learn here still.
And artificial intelligence is affecting medicine and medical research in so many profound ways. But one of the opportunities with artificial intelligence, I think you would say, is in this area of personalized nutrition and understanding us individually.
So frequently we'd use the term multimodal AI, but really what we're talking about is layers of data. And so, as you say, to get to the nuts of this, that's probably the wrong pun, but you want to get all the layers of data. So, you need to have, whether it's sensors, whether it's electronic health records, the timing of what they ate and drank and, gut microbiome. All these layers of data are going to be important and are being pursued to get to this. Now, we don't know if it's going to actually be useful, but it's worth getting a look at this. Now, it's also the same multimodal AI that's setting up our opportunity for prevention that we never had before of the age-related diseases. We're talking about billions of data points of data for any given person with 7, 10, 15 different layers of sources of data, some of which have continuous data. So this is something no human could possibly extract that data from. And so, yeah, AI is quite important.
In a few years, some of us who are early adopters like myself will likely be wearing these augmented reality glasses that are recording video, that are taking note of absolutely everything that I eat. And I think Apple has an early patent, I'm sure others do too, on less invasive continuous glucose monitor type technologies. But one can imagine just taking all the information about how our body, exactly what we're eating, exactly how our body responds. It's going to be a wealth of information.
Yeah, I think, though, I would just put some caution on this because the problem is whether it's sleep sensors or glucose sensors or, these glasses, they inhibit your, normal life. And they can take away the fun of life.
Yes.
They're good for training. Like, I think it's probably useful for people if they want to learn about their sleep for a couple of weeks or a month, or their glucose spikes, or, but I think they are inhibiting your life. If I'm going to sit down like I did the other night with my grandkids and have a slice of pizza and say, no, I'm not going to do that with them because I have this glucose sensor on, no, you want to be able to enjoy your life too. So they can make things worse.
One area that I'm not clear on, I don't know if how deep you went into this in your research, is the question of seed oils.
Yeah.
Casey Means and others think we should avoid seed oils at all costs. Tim Spector's colleagues argue that a high concentration of omega-6 fatty acids found in seed oils may actually reduce inflammation.
Yeah.
And lower the risk of cardiovascular disease. Who's telling the truth here?
Tim is.
Okay.
And this thing about the beef tallow oil.
Yeah.
Or fat. This is, you want to talk about trouble. That's, oh my gosh. And now, this is the new thing about beef tallow. Wow. This whole thing has gotten a little cuckoo again. Where are the data? Where is the evidence in well-regarded peer-reviewed studies from highly respected investigators, right?
Yeah.
And it isn't in beef tallow. I can assure you of that.
Yeah. Okay. And how about time-restricted eating and intermittent fasting? Very popular 5 years ago, fallen out of vogue. I have been eating between, say, 12 noon and 8 p.m. for the most part, more often than not, for the last, 5 years or something. And I found it works well for me. But I think there are mixed feelings about this right now.
Yeah, I think your 8 hours of eating in the day, 12 to 8, that's pretty reasonable. That's kind of the best time restricted thing. If you have breakfast at 8 and you have your last meal, at 6, you're still getting, another 14 hours between the last meal and your breakfast. So if you have a good stretch each day when you're not eating, that's a convenient form of time-restricted eating. Now, as you know, there's all these other schedules. There's, 4-3, 5-2, and,
Yes.
There's not really been shown, they help weight loss. But fasting, for a whole day, every 5 or whatever, there's no real advantage that we know of beyond the type of simple restriction, giving your body, a metabolic timeout, if you will, I think that's really where the data can be summarized.
Yes. Okay. And then vitamins and supplements.
Yeah.
You don't take any, is that correct?
None. No. No.
None. Okay.
I don't see the data to benefit. Now, if I had a deficiency that was real, I might consider it. But, most healthy people through a healthy diet like you and I have been discussing, they don't need to have vitamins. And the supplement help me on the supplement. These supplements have made bold claims without data. And many of these longevity people, some of them we call influencers, others entrepreneurs, others combinations of the above, they're hawking these supplements. And I find that really objectionable. I'm sorry, because there's no data. And they're very expensive. Like this AG1,
Yes.
it's $90 a month or something crazy with the green powder stuff. And, the claims on it of what it does. And these 4 little studies that done by the company, and that no other supplements have any data except us. That's their latest series of ads. I mean, this is just crazy. So they have testimonials from celebrities and no real data. And it's just a shame to see this. Yeah.
You talk a bit about NAD boosters, right? Which David Sinclair, I'm sure you're familiar with his work.
Oh, yeah.
Wrote about, and I've actually taken NAD boosters for a few years. I've been a little on the fence about it, honestly. I think Peter Attia is not actually an endorser of NAD boosters, but where do you land?
Yeah, there's no data to support that at all.
Yeah.
And, Venki Ramakrishnan, who wrote the book Why We Die, and, he went through that. I went through it in my book. I mean, there's just no data. But there's another thing here that you can say people are taking as a supplement, and I think maybe you were going to get into it, the rapamycin story.
Yes.
Peter does advise taking rapamycin, and there's a leaderboard of all these people taking rapamycin, and they all take different doses. That should give you pause right there, okay? And even Brian Johnson, the most extreme don't die guy, he was taking it, and he stopped because he was getting infections and side effects. But here's the problem with rapamycin. First of all, there's no human data to support it of any meaningful unit. But moreover, and this is a central point that I can't emphasize enough, we don't have an immunome right now. So if I wanted to check your immune system and how functional it is, I can't. There's nothing in the clinic to do that today. We need it desperately. But some people, everyone's different, some people will take the same dose of rapamycin and have marked suppression of their low dose rapamycin, marked suppression of their immune system. What does that do? That invites cancer and all these other bad things to happen, right? So these people that think they're going to have a pro-aging, benefit, slow their aging process, they could actually make things worse. And so where is the human study? Where is the immune system assessment? And to recommend rapamycin without this knowledge is reckless.
Yeah, that seems to be reasonable. I was looking it up this morning. I think Peter Attia continues to take rapamycin. About 10% of his patients who pay an enormous amount of money. These are very wealthy people.
You might mention how much they pay to be his patient.
Yeah, I don't know what it is. It could get into the 6 figures potentially.
Oh, right? It's in the 6 figures. Adriana Huffington, I guess, has been interacting with Peter and told me it was like $150,000 to be a patient in his early clinic. But yeah, I mean, he advocates it. It's in the book and it's in his clinic, and there's just no data. And he's not the only one. There's many others that are pushing rapamycin. Yeah.
I'm not going to come fully to his defense, but I'm going to complicate the conversation by saying that my impression following Peter over the years is that he's been very transparent about the fact that this is early and unproven and experimental and not something that normal people should do. He does have some patients who are under close medical supervision.
Yeah, okay, first of all, he wrote this book about Easter in his chapter on Easter Island and glorified the rapamycin as the ultimate thing.
Right.
Secondly, you can't measure the immune system today. So these people in his clinic and he and so many others who are taking it, they have no idea how their immune system is suppressed, to what level. And maybe they're lucky. Maybe they hit it big. But we don't know. That's a principal adverse effect. As you know, Rufus, rapamycin is used to prevent graft-host transplant rejection.
Right.
And okay, I'll take a lower dose. I'll take it once a week, or I'll take it every other day, or whatever. That same dose could be really detrimental. We're not measuring it. We don't have a way to measure it right now.
One thing I find interesting about some of these doctors and experts and influencers, as you say, and entrepreneurs who are trying to help people extend their lifespans, is that many of them have had relatives who have died early, or parents who've died early, or have had their own health struggles. Like in the case of Peter Attia, I believe his father and uncles died in their 50s and 60s or something. Casey Means' mother died in her early 70s. Tim Spector's father died from a heart attack at 57. And I think Tim suffered a stroke when he was 53. First of all, I think it's very interesting and relatable that everybody's trying to figure out how they can live a little longer and be healthier, have a longer health span. And I see some of these folks as kind of maybe extremists testing the outer boundaries, and not an example of what everybody should be doing. But maybe there's a place for some people to be. I think this is something David Sinclair said. I'm not certain that the NAB boosters are necessarily the correct answer, but I do know what the absence of intervention results in, which is death. Basically, like the aging process is, we know what happens if we don't experiment in this liminal space. I guess the way I'd frame the question is there a place for experimenters? I guess it shouldn't be endorsed for everyone, but maybe there's a place for people to experiment.
Well, this is important, what you're bringing up now, Rufus, because we have a lot of mistrust in the medical community. That's been exacerbated with the whole COVID pandemic, but it was already, well in gear before that. And so when you have somebody who's out there saying, don't believe these doctors, I've got another plan for you, there's a lot of receptivity for that where there never was before.
Right.
I take a different stance, okay? I'm not hawking any supplements. I don't have anything to gain. You don't have to pay anything to come in my clinic, okay? None of that stuff. All I'm saying is I want to review all the evidence, and I want to point out the holes. And by the way, if I saw compelling data for NAD+, or rapamycin, or you name it, I'll be the first one to say, I changed my mind because the data are there.
Yes.
But what I would never do is try to prey, which are the innocent people, oftentimes, the praying to the affluent who can afford these things, and have stuff without a basis, without the evidence, and to recommend it, That's, I think, is a real problem. And especially when there's a financial gain attached to it. That's a real problem. And now there's a company for Peter Biograph, So these things have to be put in context, and the average consumer may not understand the layers of how credible are the data. Are there any data?
Yeah.
What are the downsides? What about the potential conflicts? All these things have to be totally transparent. And so, no, I'm not into experimenting when it can be dangerous. I'm not.
Okay, that's it for today. Eric and I will be back next week to talk about microplastics, sleep hygiene, and AI. Plus, he'll share the tests and scans he thinks you should ask for at your next physical if you want to be a super-ager. If you can't wait until next week to hear it, you can listen right now by downloading the Next Big Idea app. Eric's new book, Super-Agers, is out now. As I mentioned at the top, it was chosen by our Next Big Idea Club curators, Malcolm Gladwell, Adam Grant, Susan Cain, and Daniel Pink, as one of the 2 best books of the season, along with Olga Hazan's Me But Better. If you become a Next Big Idea Club member today, we'll send you both of those books, along with reading guides, invitations to upcoming in-person and virtual events with Olga and Eric, and you'll get free access to our app and Substack Book of the Day. To learn more, go to nextbigideaclub.com. And if you decide to become a subscriber, use the code PODCAST to take 20% off your order. That's code PODCAST at nextbigideaclub.com. There's no better way to support what we do. Today's episode was produced by Caleb Bissinger and sound designed by Jason Freeman. I'm Rufus Griscom. See you next week.